This is Evolutionary Change. This is chapter 27. I know this is a highly debated topic, and for some of you, it may make you uncomfortable. Um, this is in the curriculum that the KCTCS has you guys um, studying. We'll go over a few of the highlights. There's a lot of negative connotation around evolution just due to the lack of understanding. It by no means disproves religion or it doesn't disprove God or whatever you may believe. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Just because it is a debated topic, I'm willing to sit down with anybody and kind of talk about it on a deeper level. Again, my whole goal is to not make anybody uncomfortable. It's just to just kind of move on with the curriculum as much as I can. So again, with that being said, I'll go ahead and jump into it. So this is evolutionary change. Begins with a man named Charles Darwin, pictured over here on the right hand side of the screen. Charles Darwin. He initially wanted to, I believe his father was a minister, from what I can remember reading. And he was either a minister or a physician, one of the two. But he wanted to follow in his father's footsteps, but he didn't. Of course, he sailed out on this British naval vessel, it was actually called the HMS Beagle. And during this, I think it was a 5 year voyage that it was a 5 year voyage. He began seeing these different types of animals, and he noticed that they were all different. And he developed the idea that species adapted and changed in response to their environment, what is now called evolution. If somebody asks you the definition of evolution, it would just be the ability of species to adapt and change in response to their environment. You can remember in one of the previous chapters, I talked about how there was finches, and these finches that he saw in the Galapagos Islands had different beak size, and this different beak size is kind of what really sparked the idea of evolution. But we'll go over different things that kind of support this theory. And I'll point out to you guys again the highlights, the important things, the testable items. So, natural selection. What is natural selection? It's a concept that traits that are more favorable or provide an advantage must be passed on to the next generation. So, essentially, think of an example of there's a humongous outbreak we'll call it COVID. There's a humongous outbreak of COVID, but I've adapted over time, and my body has built up a certain antibody that prevents me from getting COVID. If Of course, this would be a great thing, right? And naturally, over time, the people that don't have this antibody would die. They would get COVID and they would pass away. And as I begin to produce more offspring, if this was passed on to future generations, this would be advantageous. So this would be natural selection. This would be a trait or something that would be more favorable. Um, so Darwin was able to format the mechanism by which this change occurred, and that was through natural selection. So natural selection, um, being more favorable or having these adaptations provided an advantage to pass them on to the next generation. So an example here that I believe your book lists is the giraffe. The giraffe having the variations in neck length. So those with the longer necks would be able to reach more leaves, which means that they would be able to acquire more energy and they would be able to essentially live. They would be able to produce more offspring. And over time, obviously the longer neck giraffes, though, they would begin to mate and they would begin to produce more offspring because they were getting more food. They were able to survive, and over time, giraffes would actually develop this longer neck. So I have a slide in here. What is natural selection in here? Natural selection is survival of the fittest on a larger scale. So this is involving the entire population. So you've heard survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest is just on an organismal level, and natural selection, we're dealing with a population. And then when we apply natural selection over thousands of years, then we're beginning to see evolution. So you see the progression. So you have survival of the fittest, that's on an organismal level. Then you have natural selection, which is at a population. And then over time, uh, that's evolution. So Darwin had several different observations that helped shape this view. So the African ostrich and the South American ray, they look very similar, but they couldn't be related because they were separated by two different continents, right? So how could that be possible? Um, these birds, they looked very similar, but they were separated by um, a great amount of water. He reasoned that these two species adapted to their environments in a similar fashion. So it was really this adaptation to their environment, which is kind of what posed this idea. Again, we talk about the finch here, and that's important. That will definitely show up on an exam. Just knowing that it was the finch that he studied in the Galapagos Islands. Um, I should have bolded that so you guys would know that. But he observed that the finches on each island were similar in overall appearance, right? They looked the same, but they had difference in beak size and shape. So it's the difference in these beak sizes and shape, which is this adaptation that he was able to see. And so birds that had this particular beak size were able to hunt for prey. So they were able to hunt for prey, similar to the giraffe, right, with a longer neck. They were able to acquire food. They were able to survive, which means that they would produce offspring, um, making them the fittest organism there, right? Um, so here, this slide, essentially all I'm pointing out is individual organisms within a species exhibit variation, and that can be passed on from one generation to the next. That is what natural selection is and what evolution is. It's so the book gives an example. If I were to go out into the sun and I were to my skin would begin to darken, right, and I would begin to get tan. Um, that is not an adaptation, right? That is not an adaptation. Um, that is just within one organism, right? If I have a child, right, if I have a little boy or girl, they're not going to develop that tan. I'm not going to pass that on. But it's that change over time. It's really this heritable variation. It's the ability to pass this trait on to the next generation. Is kind of what uh, natural selection is. So again, what makes up the theory of natural selection? Organisms have to be able to compete for available resources. So if you think about it, he posed this theory that he calculated the reproductive potential of elephants. He assumed that there was an average of 100 years of life for each elephant, and each female would produce 6 offspring. And if they were able to live an average life of 750 years, there would be a population of 19 million elephants. So clearly, there wouldn't be enough food for all of these elephants. So this kind of helps support that theory of natural selection as well. So individual organisms within a population differ in terms of the reproductive success. So some individuals in a population have more favorable traits that enable them to better compete for limited resources, right? Like we said, the giraffes with the longer necks, those are going to have better reproductive success because they're able to eat and acquire food, which means that they are going to be able to produce more offspring. And again, right here, organisms become adapted to conditions as environment changes. So here I have over here Lamarck's giraffe. Maybe I said Darwin previously. Sorry, this was Lamarck. This was the Darwin's predecessor. You guys don't really need to know a lot about him. Just be familiar with the name Lamarck. But he sees the variation in the length of the giraffe's neck. And again, I don't think this is tested. This is more just an example. So adaptations are recognizable when unrelated organisms living in a particular environment display similar characteristics. So like we previously said with the African ostrich and the South American ray, they developed adaptations because they're living in a particular environment that had similar characteristics. They looked similar, but they were separated by a large body of water. So examples here I have listed, I believe your book lists are manatees and penguins and sea turtles. They all have flippers, which all help them move through water. But you can clearly see that manatees don't look like penguins and penguins don't look like sea turtles. So the development of flippers, that's an adaptation that they developed over time to help them move through water. And they begin to pass on to the next generation because why? They were able to survive in the water, which meant they could reproduce. So, biological evolution, just a definition, all the changes that have occurred due to differential reproductive success in living organisms over geological time. Um, Definitions make good exam questions. So, if someone were to ask you all the changes that occurred due to differential reproductive success is an example of, and then you would just simply put biological evolution. And again, we talked about previously the characteristics of life, just here again to kind of reiterate that. Um, this term, descent with modifications, um, essentially it's talking about um, organisms and like you have one core organism, and over time, through these different paths of evolution that they begin to be modified. But all of them share these same characteristics, right? Because they're all living, they all are made of cells. They take chemicals and energy from the environment. Remember, we said that food is taken in, broken down into nutrients, and nutrients are taken up by cells, and the cells have organelles, and the organelles undergo metabolic processes, and what's that word called again? It's metabolism. It's all the biochemical reactions, and they respond to external stimuli, and they're able to reproduce. So these are just the characteristics of life. This slide is important just because this is supporting the theory of evolution, and it's really through fossils. And again, you guys know what fossils are. I'm sure you remember in your elementary school days, middle school days, talking about fossils. And just know that fossils are formed in sedimentary rock, right? Fossil records uh, become arranged in layers called strata, right? They're just layers of rock. So again, layers are arranged from oldest to youngest. That makes sense, right? So the older things are going to be on the bottom, and the newer things are going to be on the top. So you're going to be able to see this transition of animals. And here I have a horse over here. And I believe your book actually gives this example, and I found a picture online, and you can see the different things, the different lineages that the horse was able to develop and evolve from. And I guess this was initially, I can't really see what this is called, an orohippus, and then it comes on, it's a meohippus, and then it begins to form parahippus, and then it branches off here, and you have different things. So you would actually see different layers of these horse-like creatures in the sedimentary rock, and that's kind of what was able to support this theory. And again, the most important thing to know from this slide, not to beat a dead horse, no pun intended, but it's just to know that a fossil record is formed in sedimentary rock, and that kind of supports the theory of evolution. This slide's important as well. So like I said, you're able to see the different transitions through the fossil records. And here we have something called a transitional link, and these transitional links were able to be visualized in the fossil records because you do have this progression from an older structure into the newer structure, right? So, and in between those, we have something called a transitional link, and all a transitional link is an intermediate form, but and your book gives an example here of an Archaeopteryx. I'm not exactly sure how to say that word, but an Archaeopteryx. It's a creature that lived 165 million years ago, and it was a transitional link or an intermediate form between a transition of a dinosaur and a bird. So again, knowing that word, Archaeopteryx, intermediate form, link, transitional link between a dinosaur and a bird. And again, all a transitional link is it's just the transition between one organism to the other, and these were found in fossils. Here, this slide is just talking about the biochemical evidence, and again, this is highly controversial. And again, I don't really, um, personally, I'm a man of faith, and I don't really, this doesn't disprove religion for me or anything like that. Um, but again, this has been proven. The degree of similarity in DNA nucleotide sequences or the degree of similarity in amino acid sequences of proteins have been examined. The more similar the DNA sequences are, generally the more closely related the organisms are. So they did a comparison of DNA between humans and chimpanzees. They're 97% similar, right? I'm not going to beat a dead horse on this one either. All that come down to, your book talks about this, I believe it's a protein complex called cytochrome C. And the more closely related the structures are, the more closely cytochrome C was related to each other. And they just differ by a few amino acid residues. So we won't really go into anything else. Anatomical evidence. So you have vertebrate forelimbs that were used for flight of certain organisms, right? Um, Birds and bats, whales and seals, horses, lizards, monkeys. All of these serve functions for these vertebrate animals. And what is unique about this is that they all had the same set of bones organized in a similar way despite their dissimilar function, right? So the horses use the forelimbs for running, the lizards use them for climbing, and the monkeys use them to swing from trees. They all had the same bones, right? They all had the same bone structure. Um, and they were even organized in a similar way, but they adapted to their environment differently, right? So they use them to adapt to their environment, and they use them in a different way. So the most plausible explanation that can be drawn from this is that they belong to a common ancestor. Remember when we said common descent, right? We had this common ancestor, and the modification plan occurred in the succeeding groups as each continued along its own evolutionary path. And again, we have this picture here. So you could say that the common descent was from the Orthohippus, and here was your different evolutionary lineages. So you could go here, and then they all had the same anatomical structure, right? They all had the same organization of the forelimbs, but this isn't a good example, but let's say this organism here may have used the forelimbs for in a different manner than this organism. So just want you to see these evolutionary branches as the main point I'm trying to deliver. Anatomical evidence. We talk about homologous structures. So homologous structures are anatomically similar because they are inherited from a common ancestor. So we would say the forelimbs were homologous structures. Analogous structures serve the same function, right? But are not constructed similar. Again, this is a tongue twister, right? Homologous structures are anatomically similar, right? They are designed the same. They have the same structure, and they're inherited from a common ancestor, right? So, analogous structure serve the same function, but are not constructed similar. So, the example I have listed here of an analogous structure is the wings of birds and insects, the eyes of human, and the eyes of octopi or octopus, whichever you want to say. Those are analogous structures, right? Obviously, birds and insects use wings to fly, but birds and insects do not have the same, they're not constructed the same. Their wings are formed differently. So it's the presence of this homology, not that analogy, that is evidence that the organisms are related. This slide's important, primarily just knowing what a vestigial structure is. So if I give you a definition and I said these are anatomical features that are fully developed in one group of organisms, but are reduced and may have no function in similar groups. So this is the term vestigial structure. This will be on exam. The book has an example listed here that birds have developed wings for flight, but ostriches, obviously, they can't fly, or they can't fly very far. So both of them have wings, but the ostrich doesn't necessarily use their wings. So That's what's called a vestigial structure. And if I remember correctly, the appendix in humans, that was thought to be a vestigial structure. At one point, the appendix was thought to serve a function. And really, in the human body now, it has no function. The appendix, the only thing it's really good for is getting inflamed and have to come out through an appendectomy. But knowing what a vestigial structure is, that's important. And here I have an example of homologous structures. Here you have the forelimbs of humans. You've got the radius and the ulna on both. And you can see the dog also, their forelimbs are designed the same.